Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for a webinar on harassment investigations, specifically related to he said, she said claims. A couple of things to go over before we get into the topic matter. I want to remind everyone that all of your phone lines are muted, so if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can go ahead and use the questions or chat feature. We will address all questions that are posted throughout the webinar during our Q&A portion at the end. But again, feel free to go ahead and type in those questions as we're moving through, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. You will be receiving a copy of this presentation as well as some supplemental documents following the webinar. You should get those within a couple of days. And as always, we do welcome your feedback. So at the end of the webinar, we'd appreciate if you could take a moment to respond to the post-webinar survey, as well as take the opportunity to look on our website and see what other webinars we have coming up in the future. My name is Autumn Lowry, and I am the manager of professional services here at Business Controls. Business Controls is a provider of incident reporting and case management software, and we also offer risk consulting services. My role is within those consulting services, and areas of expertise include conducting and overseeing our corporate investigations team, conducting workplace violence threat assessments, as well as conducting these types of trainings. I do webinar-style trainings as well as instructor-led on-site trainings through a variety of different topics. I do have my master's degree in forensic psychology. My history before coming to Business Controls was working with criminals, and I've made the switch over to working in the corporate realm about 6 years ago. Before we get started with the webinar, I do want to give you a quick disclosure. I will be using some real examples from actual cases that I've worked. Some of these examples may include, due to the nature of the topic we're discussing, some of my examples may include subject matters or words that could be viewed as offensive. I want to go ahead and apologize in advance. It is not my intent to offend anyone who's listening to this webinar. Again, I just want to be using real life examples and giving you real context to these types of situations. In this webinar, I'm going to discuss how to conduct harassment investigations, specifically when you have no witnesses. We'll start out actually defining harassment and then outline the investigative approach that you would use in these types of investigations. We'll loop around at the end talking about how to weigh credibility and how to identify deception in order to aid in investigative conclusions. What is harassment? Many who are listening on this webinar are probably aware that employees use the word harassment a lot, and they often have no idea what they mean when they're saying it. Most of the time when employees are using the word harassment, they're referring to some kind of bullying or intimidating behavior. Harassment does have a specific definition, and it is a form of employment discrimination as it relates to Title VII. So basically, it's any kind of unwelcome conduct based upon a protected class. So in order for an individual, for harassment to apply under Title VII, there has to be an individual that is receiving unwelcome conduct based on a protected class. So we're talking about race, ethnicity, gender. The only exception to that would be retaliation. So any kind of unwelcome conduct based on the fact that somebody participated in an investigation, whether it's a discrimination charge, testifying, or participating in any kind of way that is related to this specific Title VII law. The unwelcome conduct is going to become a violation when it's either becomes a condition of the person's employment, so it's kind of what we refer to as the quid pro quo or this for that, or when the conduct is severe or pervasive enough to create a work environment that a reasonable person would consider intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So there's a couple of words in there that I want to go ahead and define. So the conduct must be severe or pervasive, meaning it can't just be one one little sleight of the eyes or one little nonverbal cue is not going to be viewed as severe. So if you're going to have one incident, it would be a pretty egregious situation or outlandish situation. And pervasive, meaning that it's occurring over a period of time. So if there are just little, nonverbal cues, little, I hate to define it as little, but insults that maybe aren't as inflammatory, derogatory, but still against someone's protected class. If those are occurring over a longer period of time, then that would reach the definition of pervasive. On the slide, we have a couple of examples of offensive conduct. So it can include things like offensive jokes, slurs, any kind of physical assaults or threats, intimidation, insults, offensive pictures or objects. Sexual harassment does fall under harassment. It is a form of harassment. It does not have to be sexual in nature. So somebody doesn't have to be making comments that are sexual in nature. It can just include offensive remarks about a person's sex or about a person's gender. For example, making blanket stereotype comments about women, maybe talking about an employee got in a car accident and somebody in the office jokes about it and said, oh, well, it must have been Debbie because she's the only woman here, and we all know women are bad drivers. That kind of a thing would be considered sexual harassment because it's a remark about a person's sex. In general, when you are investigating harassment, the victim or the reporting party can be anybody affected by the offensive conduct. So going back to my example of the woman driver or employee, Debbie, Debbie doesn't have to have been offended by the comment in order for there to be a complaint. Somebody else just could have overheard it and they were offended by it, and so they reported a complaint. So whether or not the actual recipient of the comment feels offended, there still might be an issue. It depends on how everyone else who heard it is feeling. So the victim doesn't have to be the one who takes offense. Also, the EEOC, when they come in or when a claim gets to the point that they're looking into the investigation, they're going to look at the entire record to try and determine whether the conduct was severe or pervasive. So what that means is they're going to look at the actual nature of the conduct, the context in which the alleged instance occurred, and whether that situation is ongoing. It is important to know that there are not any straight or clear lines or answers here when doing a harassment investigation. Everything is looked on a case-by-case basis, so you really do have to consider the context of what's going on and all different aspects of it. There are several methods that you can use when conducting an investigation. I've listed out here the 6 methods that we use here at Business Controls. Now, a harassment investigation, it's not going to be, some of these methods are more advantageous than others. It's not likely because here we're talking about specifically he said, she said case where we have no witnesses. So I'm going to go ahead and rule out physical and electronic surveillance, because if you have any kind of electronic surveillance or any kind of cameras, then you essentially would have a witness. Of course, you want to make sure you check if there were cameras in the area and things like that so that you could review it. The electronic surveillance could aid in corroborating some facts, but not necessarily prove your case. For example, an employee could complain that their supervisor was making certain comments to them at a certain time. Well, if you have cameras and can corroborate the time and date of when the reporting party claimed it happened, that's going to help speak to that person's credibility. Now, you're not going to be able to prove whether or not those comments were made based on that footage, but it's going to be a data point for you to use when determining credibility. Undercover in these types of investigations are generally not going to be worth the investment, the time, or the money that it takes to be putting someone in that kind of a role. It's just not a preferred method, particularly in these types of cases. For investigations that have no witnesses, we rely heavily upon research and audit and interviews. So those are the main methods that we would be using. Forensic analysis can be helpful if it's worth the investment. So forensic analysis, such as reviewing somebody's computer, can yield important information, but it is costly. So it's going to cost a couple $1,000s to be able to take somebody's computer and really dig into it and look at all the information. I would generally recommend trying to go the research and audit route and start with some initial interviews before you immediately jump into the forensic analysis. However, it definitely can help. For example, I can think of a recent case I worked on. There was an allegation of sexual harassment. We literally had a female employee who claimed that the male employee was making unwanted comments, and that she attempted to tell him that she wasn't interested, but he continued to pursue her. There were no witnesses. All this stuff was happening over the phone, so there wasn't any kind of records of it. And then we had the male individual. After we started the investigation, he then accused the female of engaging in unethical sales practices. So we had accusations flowing left and right, and we weren't really sure who was doing what. We opted to go ahead and conduct some forensic analysis on one of their computers, and we found on the male individual's computer a folder that included the female's name and referred to her as that bitch. And so that was some pretty good evidence, and then nonetheless the information contained within that folder was all information that he was trying to slander her with. So that really gave him a strong motivation to be lying, and certainly a lack of credibility when he was talking about his claims against her. So it's a good example of where forensic analysis was helpful. The reason we opted to use that in that particular case is because these were two very high-ranking individuals. They were not going to be able to work together. Something was definitely going on, and we just had to get to the bottom of it so that the organization could deal with it and move forward, regardless of which side it would have fallen on. So they were willing to make that investment. So moving on to research and audit and interviews. These are going to be preferred methods that you're going to use most frequently. Just a quick overview or definition. The difference between research and audit. Research is going to be information that you're gathering externally, so looking at public records, social media, and things like that. Audit's going to refer to really those internal documents. In a he said, she said case, it is crucial to be reviewing all audit documents that are available to you. Even if you don't think there's anything in there, if you don't look, you won't know. So one of the main pieces that we're getting is personnel files of both the reporting party as well as the accused, attendance history, access control records, company email. So company email tends to fall in the audit category and not forensics, because you guys own that email as an organization and can just have your local IT guys kind of filter through and pull that stuff out. So it's not going to raise that level of specialty or expertise. Keep in mind that when you're getting this information, we are not on a witch hunt. We are not trying to prove that one side did it or one side didn't do it. The goal of an investigation is to understand the true nature and scope of the problem. So we just need to gather as many data points as we can so that when we get to the end of the investigation, we can sit back, observe all those points in one big picture, and see where everything's laying. It's amazing how when you get into an investigation, you can get caught up in the details, but as long as you're just documenting those points along the way, once you have that opportunity to sit back and team consult, things tend to fall into place. Gathering all this information not only is going to paint that picture for you, but it's also just gathering facts for your interview. So we want to make sure that people are being consistent with the information that they're sharing, not just about the specific claim, but about all of their history. So if somebody can't be truthful about maybe some issues they've previously had with their supervisor that you know happened because you have a record of it in their personnel file, you're going to question if they're going to be able to be truthful about the actual incident. So again, just data points and just trying to give you context when you go into those interviews with individuals. For interviews, we always want to start with the reporting party, regardless of what kind of investigation it is, and we will end with the accused. Now, what's different or unique about a he said, she said case is it's the most frequent time that you would that you may need to loop around with the reporting party. There are a couple of reasons to loop around with the reporting party. Initially, you have your reporting party making their complaint. You talk to your other character witnesses, you gather your documentation, and you end with the accused. Sometimes you get to that accused individual and you weren't able to find this along the whole way, and they just give you the gold nugget and say, no, that's not true, that's not what happened, I believe this person is lying, and this is why. And they share with you some kind of reason that this person may falsify the information. Well, you need to go back and follow up with that with the reporting party. There are several ways or conclusions that you can come to in these types of investigations. Either the behavior is occurring as reported, B, perhaps there is some behavior occurring, but it's not exactly as reported, which may be some kind of misperception on one end or the other end. Or the final thing, it is did not occur as it reported, and we may have a situation of false reporting. So you want to be sure to loop around with that, because false reporting is going to be just as serious as an issue sometimes as the initial issue that was risen. When there are no witnesses, there are always people to interview. So just because you don't have any direct witnesses doesn't mean you're not going to have anybody else to interview. People such as supervisors, managers, peers, these are all going to be good people to look at. You definitely want to be selective. We don't need to go talk to every single person who's in the office, but you kind of want to look at the group as a whole. I always start with management so that they can give me some kind of context. You want to get a feeling for who's friends with who's enemies with who, so you can kind of have a balanced view of who you choose to actually interview. You would also if the claim is specific to some kind of race, ethnicity, you're going to want to try and look at some kind of comparators. So when you're choosing the peers, that may be something that you take into account, whether it be their race or their age, even their date of hire. What kind of questions would you focus on asking these non-direct witness individuals? We always focus on the work environment, asking people, how is their work environment? Do they have any concerns about their work environment? How are the interactions among coworkers? Are there any concerns about anyone's work performance? Oftentimes, when we get harassment claims, we end up the claim is, oh, my boss is picking on me, they're treating me differently, and by the time we get to the end of it, a decent percentage ends up to conclude that the employee who's making the complaint had some kind of work performance issue. And so, yeah, maybe their supervisor is treating them differently, but it's because they're not performing their job, right, or they're not doing something like they're supposed to. So asking other employees and peers about work performance helps give you that independent perspective, because just because the manager says they're not performing well, shouldn't take that at face value. We want to have performance evaluations to back it up. If you don't have that documented, then that's when we go to our peers. You're also going to get some character information. You know, and straight ask questions, you know, straight up. People appreciate honesty. So asking, hey, you know, is there anybody in this group that you think would be willing to speak with me, that you think would be honest with me? People are usually pretty willing to identify other people, or maybe say, is there anybody who you think is pretty neutral and isn't particular friends with anyone in this group? So use those times in those interviews to have them help you identify who else to speak with. This process is a lot easier when you have the manager who's the individual accused. So we always want to be careful to not out anyone, right? We don't need to let the employees we're interviewing know exactly what the complaint is against the manager, because what if it's not true, right? We don't want to taint that work relationship. We don't want to make it any worse than it potentially is. But when you have a manager, it's really easy to go into that interview under the guise of, hey, we're just checking up, there's been some general concerns, we're just interested in where you feel you know, you are, we want to take a temperature, and it's a nice benign approach, and it gives people an opportunity to just kind of give open feedback. And you tend to get a lot of information. In a he said, she said case, you definitely need to weigh credibility to aid in the conclusion because there is often no other evidence that you have. He said, she said generally refers to when you get down to the end of the investigation, you have almost a 50-50 split. So one person saying one thing, the other person saying the complete opposite, and you have nothing differentiating them. That's where we're going to want to start looking at credibility, and we're going to want to look and see, and we're going to want to use techniques to detect deception in our interviews. So what is better than having an admission? Nothing. So we want to make sure that during our interviews we are constantly, particularly in these types of claims, constantly analyzing individuals' behaviors to try and determine if they are being deceitful. And if we do believe they are being deceitful, we need to confront them on that. Most of the time, if you are using the proper techniques and follow up with proper confrontation, those situations will more likely than not lead to some kind of admission, and then you don't even have to worry about going back to the credibility piece because you have them acknowledging that they engaged in it. But what is credibility? So there are many different definitions of credibility. Some of these words up here are just the most common that I found or that people use when describing it. So capable of being believed, to be trustful, reliable, to be able to be objective. Credibility assessments are a process involving one or more credibility judgment. So when you're making the assessment, it's going to be made up of several different judgments, and then again, you take a step back and see how all those judgments relate to the whole picture. It can apply to a specific fact or be in general. So you can determine that in general, so-and-so seems credible based on, and then you want to be able to list out why their information seems credible. Now, somebody could be really credible in general, but they're just not credible related to one particular fact because everything else they said seemed to match up, but there's one particular fact that just is consistently not being corroborated, and that's okay. You just want to be able to articulate where you find them credible and where you don't find them credible. Most people have difficulty detecting deceit. Why is it so difficult? It is difficult because most people generally believe that others are honest. So it's harder to, most people are going in with the assumption that people are going to be truthful and honest with their information. Luckily, in general, most people are honest, so that gives us an advantage when we are interviewing individuals. We're lucky that we're speaking to employees, so most of these people do not have an extensive history of being in trouble. They don't have any kind of experience of being in any kind of interview situation. And we can use that to our advantage. It is much more difficult to detect deceit from an individual who's been involved in the criminal justice system. So when you have employees who have been involved, who've been convicted, who've been arrested, who have been through that kind of interrogation, or who are very knowledgeable of the law or lawyers, those individuals tend to be a little bit more difficult to work with. But again, lucky for us, we don't have to deal with that too frequently during our interviews. What are some things you should look for to determine credibility in detecting deceit? I've got a couple on here, some slides for consistency, past history, motivations, and their demeanor. Consistency. We want to make sure that individuals are able to provide information that is consistent with other information. Now, obviously, we're not having direct witnesses to these investigations, so I'm not talking about the actual incident. We want to make sure that they're able to provide consistent information in general, so about the work environment or about their relationships. You want to look at the information that they're sharing and make a general determination. Is it believable at face value? Does this even make logical sense? That's a good determination, a good place to start off on. I have an example of an investigation involving an individual who was an assembler in a machining operation. We believe that this individual sent an anonymous letter out to the company accusing a supervisor of engaging in making a lot of derogatory statements, using extremely racially motivated offensive words when describing other employees. The letter at face value seemed ridiculous. So the scenario that the employee put out was, oh, I was just sitting at this restaurant and I heard all these things happening, and the way that it was set up, that person would have been sitting there for at least 2 hours listening to all this information, had not responded. The other coworker didn't even notice them there while they were sitting there taking notes on all this conversation. So it just didn't logically make sense. It didn't logically fit together. Then also, when we interviewed this individual that we believed sent the letter and started asking about his relationship with his supervisor, he said that he had a great relationship with his supervisor. He had no problems with their interaction. Yet every single one of the 20 other employees that we spoke to identified this employee as the only person who has significant issues with the supervisor. So he just wasn't providing any kind of consistent information. He wasn't willing to acknowledge that he had any kind of issues, which pretty much just made him not credible in any of his statements towards us. Another thing with consistency is checking for consistency through retelling the stories from different starting points. So the way our mind works as far as the cognitive process, it is easier to maintain a lie when you are reporting the lie in a consistent fashion. So what you want to do is break up the scenario. So let them tell their story. They're going to say it in some kind of chronological order. Pick somewhere towards the middle or the end and ask them a couple of questions about it, and then ask them to go backwards to recall information. Well, what did you do before that? Well, what did you do before that? It's a lot more difficult to maintain the lie when you're trying to work your brain in reverse. So it kind of goes with rehearsal and things like that. So that's a good way to try and shake somebody up, and if they can't consistently report the information, then you're going to have some doubts about whether or not they're being truthful. Past history and motivations. In psychology, famous line that we always say, the best predictor of future behavior is past history. While this is not an automatic end-all be-all, just because somebody engaged in some previous behavior doesn't mean they're going to do it in the future, and doesn't mean that's enough proof to nail somebody. It is a very strong data point. In that example that I shared with you about the machining employee who we believed sent that anonymous letter, which we ultimately concluded was falsified, when looking at some research of the public domain, we found that this individual had actually recently been arrested for making a false report to police officers. In looking at his personnel file, we also found that he had previously made a similar claim against a different person, and that was determined to be falsified as well. So knowing that he had engaged in that behavior several times before makes it a lot easier to assume that it's not a far stretch that he would engage in that behavior during this scenario. You do want to review the motive to falsify. So is there any reason, is there any gain that this person could have to falsifying their statements? So do they have any kind of, are they allied with any particular employees? Might they gain some kind of benefit from lying? And that benefit doesn't have to be in the form of some kind of promotion or monetary reward. It could just be having that friendship or not outing somebody that you're close to. As I think I stated earlier, one of the most common reasons we fall, or motivations we find for filing false reports or maybe not being so accurate in the report that you file would be that someone just recently underwent a performance review, was recently disciplined, or put on some kind of performance improvement plan. Now again, just because that happened recently, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that their claim is not legit, but it is another data point. And when you look at all of these data points and they start adding up, it makes the picture pretty clear. Demeanor. You want to note the overall impression that the witness is giving you. So you want to observe how they're reacting to your questions. Are they friendly or hostile? Do they seem forthcoming with information? You want to look for signs of deception in their behavior and posture. Now, it is important to note that any changes in behavior is what we're looking for. So you want to start out your interview in assessing the person in what we refer to as a normal mode. So at the beginning of the interview, you're building rapport, you're asking them benign questions, and you're observing how they're behaving, what their posture's like, what their eye contact's like. And what you want to look for is any change in that behavior once you start getting to the tough questions. So once you start asking them questions about the incident or about their interactions with the involved individuals, that's where you want to look for any of these changes, any signs of anxiety, defensiveness, some physical things that looking for, or that they suddenly start tapping their feet, constantly looking at the clock or at their watch. We have the classic, what you refer to as the lint picker. So you have someone who, is acting like they're picking something off of their pants that's really not even there. Complaining that the room is too hot, the room is too cold, they need a drink of water. Those types of things tend to indicate that they're trying to stall or that they're overly nervous. If they're being arrogant, disrespectful, argumentative, those tend to be behaviors of somebody who's trying to hide something or somebody who's not being truthful. Do take into account that there could be other reasons for this. So just because someone's engaging in this behavior does not mean they're absolutely lying. But again, data points, that's what we're looking for. We want to gather these data points to say, okay, this is more clear and this appears to be somebody who's lying. There could be, medical reasons that someone behaves a certain way, or it could just be personality reasons. So you do want to be very objective when looking at these types of things. A couple of things about posture, if they're slouched, you start asking them those tough questions. They lean back, they cross their arms, having that closed stance, cover their face or mouth when they're answering particular questions. Some of these behaviors are ridiculously obvious during interviews, and some are a lot more subtle. So it's not every time you get into an interview with someone and they're lying, you may or may not be able to figure it out. The point is to be observant and constantly analyzing the situation. So the more data you have, the more confident you are in where your conclusion sits. An example of the deceptive posture, again, going back to my machining example, the individual at the beginning of the conversation was definitely nervous, which it doesn't mean anything in and of itself. He's coming into an employee interview. A lot of people are going to be nervous in that situation. So since he was nervous from the beginning, that wasn't really anything that I put much focus on. However, when we really started asking him questions about the letter and about his timing to arriving at work that morning and distributing the letter, he got a very extreme dry mouth, was not able to clearly form sentences because his mouth was so dry. And by the end of me asking him the hard questions, he had pretty much turned his chair completely opposite. He wasn't even facing me anymore. He wouldn't make eye contact with me. If he did make any eye contact, it was with my witness interviewer, who was simply taking notes. So to me, that was an extremely obvious, strong indicator that he was lying and that he was not being truthful with that information that he was sharing with me. So not all of them are that easy, not all of them are that obvious, but the more experience you have and the more you observe, the easier it's going to be to pick up on this type of stuff. Some things you want to look for in the demeanor, in deceptive responses, is if they answer your question with a question. It's kind of a stalling tactic. They repeat questions that you're asking them. Inability to recall non-incriminating facts. So if they just don't recall anything, well, I don't remember. That's somebody who's probably not being very honest with you. They should be able to recall or should be able to acknowledge some facts, especially when they aren't incriminating. Having selective memory or memory extremes is a really good indicator. I love it when somebody can recall to me in detail what happened 2 months ago, and then when I ask them about an incident that occurred 2 days ago, all of a sudden they have no idea, and that they just don't remember things well. So that's something that I call people on and say exactly that. I don't understand how you just detailed to me a conversation that happened 2 months ago, yet you're telling me you can't recall what happened 2 days ago. So you want to make them feel uncomfortable, and just leave that pause. Let them fill it in with whatever rubbish they may have, whatever information they may have, and eventually they tend to feel uncomfortable enough that they come out with it. Any kind of delayed answers, using language such as to tell you the truth, that's kind of deflecting the situation. And someone says, well, I'm going to be honest with you. I often want to stop them and say, oh, really? So were you not being honest with me during the first 20 minutes that we were talking? So those kind of statements tend to indicate some kind of deception. You can't prove it is an excellent indicator of deception. It's a stall tactic. They're basically demanding proof, but they're not making any kind of statement of innocence. So they're not saying you can't prove it because I didn't do anything. They're just saying you can't prove it because they're trying to find out if you can prove it and if you do have information so that they know how much they need to share with you so that they can still get away with it. Why would I lie about that? That's also going to just kind of be a stalling tactic. They're answering a question with a question, trying to give them time to think of a better answer. Also, a sign of deception would be someone who resists assigning blame or punishment. So you talk to someone and they deny. Say, okay, so let's say you didn't engage in this behavior. Can you think of anybody else who is angry enough or who might be in a situation where they would have done it? Somebody who resists assigning that blame is usually because they know they did it and they don't want to get anybody else in trouble, or they throw out a completely logical person. So, well, I don't know, but maybe it was Tom. Well, why would you think it was Tom? Well, I don't know. The name just popped in my head. So at this point, again, they're just trying to deflect you and get you off the trail. Also, resisting assigning punishment. That's an interesting question to ask individuals when they're denying things, is what do you think should happen in this situation? What do you think should happen when we catch the individual who engaged in this behavior? Oftentimes, if you're interviewing the person who did it, they're either going to completely minimize the punishment that they should have, say that the person shouldn't be punished at all, or again, minimize it in some way and say, well, they probably only did it because they felt that was the only way they could get their issue dealt with, or something like that. So they're significantly minimizing the information, but you want to take that minimization and then use it against them. So you know that they felt that they engaged in that behavior because it was the only way they could maybe get the attention of HR to deal with the issue. So you can use that later on in your questioning as, I understand that you didn't feel like HR was being responsive, and I understand that there was no other way to do this, and it makes sense to me that this is a way to get their attention because it worked, didn't it? And kind of help them work their way through that rationalization. Overcoming denials. So when you do have an individual that you believe is being deceptive, so whether you're looking at their posture, behavior, what they're actually saying, there are several techniques to confront that and overcome that denial. So basically what you're doing is taking the cues that you've gotten that lead you to believe they are not being truthful and taking other information that you've gained during the course of that interview to help them be okay with becoming truthful. So people lie for a variety of reasons. Most frequently, they're lying because they don't want to get in trouble, or they don't want to be humiliated. They don't want to be viewed as a bad person. So you need to help them overcome those beliefs. You need to acknowledge the source of fear, acknowledge the realities. Hey, I don't know. This could end in some kind of termination or discipline. I don't know at this point. What I do know is that no decisions have been made regarding the outcome at this point, and the organization is going to take into account your level of commitment. So you want to encourage the individual that you haven't made a decision, and those decisions will be influenced by their level of participation. And it will be. So we're not lying here. You shouldn't have made a decision before you've gone into this interview with the individual, and you do need to take into account their level of cooperation. Now, are you saying they're not going to be terminated? Absolutely not, because you don't know that. You don't know how it's going to come out. No matter how sorry they say, it's a violation of zero tolerance policy, and they are going to be terminated. And that's okay as long as you're acknowledging that that's a possibility, but recognizing that they can possibly have influence on that. Make sure that you do call them out with confidence in those denials. So you should feel comfortable saying, I don't believe you. I don't think you're being truthful with me, and this is why. Can you help me feel that I believe you? They have to understand that they need to convince you that they're not lying. So try to let them talk their way out of that. You can offer one or more rationalizations or a reason to tell the truth. So, again, kind of going back to, I understand that this was a moment of weakness and that you felt there were no other outlets for you to get HR's attention. So I understand why you may have taken this route in order to get their attention. That's a good way to kind of ease them into just agreeing with you. We call that a tacit admission. So at that point, yeah, you know what, you're right. This was the only way I thought I could get their attention, and so I felt like I had to send that letter out. Well, you just basically got them to admit to it without asking any kind of formal question. Did you do it? Did you do it is never going to get an answer of yes. It's just people are smarter than that, and they're not going to answer in the affirmative when it's a direct question. You need to help them feel comfortable acknowledging that information. Offering them a reason to tell the truth. So saying, this is your opportunity to fix this. This is your opportunity to explain your actions. I don't think you're a bad person. I know that sometimes things just happen, and this is your opportunity to apologize to the organization or to really be part of the solution. Making those kind of comments is going to be appealing to the individual's sense of duty, sense of responsibility, and really their character. Nobody wants to be viewed as a bad person, and so you're really appealing to that aspect. Things never to do during investigation. Avoid questions that are too specific. So we don't want to ask, for example, did you say blank? That's really specific, and again, it's almost guaranteed to get you the answer of no. So you want to be more roundabout in your questions. Is it possible that some kind of comment was made in relation to, and then include some kind of general category of information. So you want them to help lead you. Once you get the little admissions, it's easy to push it down the path to get the ultimate admission to the specific behavior. But again, you've got to walk them there. You can't just say, did you say this? It's just not going to come out that way. It's not that easy. Try to avoid using compound sentences or double negatives. So, for example, did you make this comment, or did one of your coworkers say it? Right? We don't want to confuse them with multiple questions, because then they get to choose what they want to answer and how they want to answer it. It's good to be specific in the questions that you're asking. Double negatives, again, can just be confusing. They don't understand what you're asking, and quite honestly, you probably don't even know what you're asking by that point. So if they answer yes, what are they answering yes to? It just adds a lot of confusion. Make sure you confront them when you think they're lying. Do resist assigning blame on the victim. That is not a good way to align with the accused individual. We don't want to gang up against the victim. We don't want to put anything in their mind that we don't believe the victim. We just need to definitely stay away from that. And you don't offer to intervene on behalf of the subject. So, for example, don't say that you control the outcome, or if he tells the truth, then you're not going to get the police involved or anything like that. We don't want to make promises that we can't keep. again, going back to kind of that staple comment that I made, is that at this point, no decisions have been made, and the organization is going to make a decision with or without your participation, but your level of commitment or your level of participation could influence the outcome. So there is the possibility, but we don't want to give them any kind of guarantees. Couple of closing points. I know I went over a lot of stuff there. It's pretty high level, pretty fast. But in he said, she said investigations, you need to be making credibility determinations of each individuals that you're interviewing, as well as specific aspects. Remember that this is all data. You are simply gathering massive amounts of data. You need to take a step back, process the information on a macro level. Here at Business Controls, we are constantly team consulting. So just to take a step back and bounce the story off of somebody else is often very insightful and can help you come to a conclusion. You're looking to draw a reasonable conclusion based on the facts and your determinations of credibility. So ask yourself, is it more likely than not that this behavior occurred, taking into account that you have one person that's totally not credible? So if you have one individual that you can't believe anything that comes out of their mouth and another individual that seems to be pretty darn consistent in everything they're reporting, well, it's more likely than not to have occurred the way the credible person reported it. So that's what you're looking at. I think when we get to the end of these investigations, sometimes the reason investigators are frustrated and throw up their hands is, I just don't have anything. I don't have that smoking gun. I don't have that witness. I don't have that document. You don't have to have that. In workplace investigations, we are drawing reasonable conclusions. So as long as you are looking at the information and are reasonably concluding that it likely occurred this way because, and you can articulate that, right? Somebody's credible, somebody's not. That's what the court wants to see. So making that reasonable determination is where we're going. This entire process can be time-consuming and very difficult, but investigators who effectively assess the factors that we discuss stand a much better chance of correctly assessing witness credibility and ultimately determining the truth of the matter. So very convoluted, a lot of stuff that we're looking at. Obviously, as an internal investigator, you need to determine how much time and resources are spent on each investigation depending on the seriousness of the claim. With these particular Title VII investigations, there's a lot at stake. So it is good to make that investment on the onset, because if someone's not happy with the outcome, you can almost be guaranteed that they're going to go ahead and run to the EEOC, and you want to be able to respond to the EEOC and say, you know what, they brought this up, we did an investigation, and here's our conclusions. And you'll have it all laid out, and it's just a lot easier to deal with that way. All right. So we are finished up with the content portion. Again, I know that was a lot of information. There's a lot of different scenarios you can apply it to. This is now the question and answer portion. So I'm going to go over some of these questions with you guys. Do know that we are here to help you in any kind of situation. So if you do have follow-up questions, of course, continue to type them in and we'll definitely address them. And feel free to give us a call if you have a specific situation that you'd like some consulting on or help brainstorm different ways to approach it. We'd be happy to walk you through those. So a couple of questions. Can it still be harassment if the victim also engages in the behavior? So for example, if there's joking back and forth. Very good question. It depends. Just probably the answer to most of these questions. So like I said at the beginning, somebody just has to be offended. So if somebody thinks it's completely joking and they're continuing to engage in the behavior, it can still be harassment because an outside party can be listening to those comments and they may be offended by those comments. So then it could still be viewed as harassment. Generally, if the person is complaining of harassment and the complainer is also engaging in the joking back and forth, that's where it gets a lot more sticky. So there has to have been some kind of statement or act that the person felt the behavior or the conduct was unwelcomed. So if someone is willingly engaging in that behavior and doesn't ever say it's unwelcome, doesn't ever ask anyone to stop, and then try to claim harassment, that's going to be a much more difficult case because they were actively engaging in it. All right. Somebody asked, is threatening to sue an indicator of deception? I think it depends on what they're threatening to sue. So generally in how they share the information. So if they're really argumentative and defensive, if they are, I can't believe this, I don't even have to sit here and listen to this, and I'm going to sue you for defamation or something like that. That's kind of more of an outrageous response. So I would say that in general, that would lead me more to a conclusion that they're probably not being completely truthful with the information that they're sharing. Somebody asked something about false confessions, and are you concerned about false confessions when you are looking at the different deception techniques and trying to rationalize somebody acknowledging or admitting behavior? I'm not too worried about false confessions. The reason being, in the criminal justice system, their studies seem to show that there's a decent percentage of individuals who do falsely confess. However, most of those studies support that the reason people are engaging in false confessions are due to the interrogation techniques. In corporate interviews, we ethically are not engaging in those same techniques. We're not lying, we're not intimidating, we're not coercing, we're not using tactics such as isolation and things like that. So because our techniques are more ethical, we have a lot less likely percentage of individuals who are engaging in false confessions. So as long as you're approaching it in an ethical manner, that's not really something that I would worry about. Okay. How do you draw a reasonable conclusion when one person is internal and one is external, and very little is known about the external person? That's a very good question. It's going to come down to the same stuff, though. So while you may have less access to information about the external person, they probably interact with at least one other person in your organization. So you want to talk to those other people that may interact with them, depending on your business relationship. So of course we all have to make decisions on how far we're going to go into with vendors or clients for the sake of the business. But it may be appropriate to put that organization on notice, or even come from it at the angle of, look, we have some concerns about our employee, and we want to make sure that we're being the best, that we have the best relationship with you as possible. So in an effort of getting this resolved, would you mind providing us with access to, some of this person's peers to interview, or their personnel file or things like that. You can always do that public domain research to try and get a character temperature on the external individual, and then it's just going to come down to facts. I mean, who's being more consistent about the information that they're presenting, even about processes that they follow. I mean, can they consistently talk about that information? So it is possible. It's just about getting as much data as you possibly can. And just because the external person only has a few data points on them and the internal person has 20 data points on them, that shouldn't affect the way you're weighing credibility, because credibility is based on the information that they're sharing. Just because you don't have a lot of it doesn't mean you still can't draw that kind of conclusion. Okay. We are pretty much done to the end of the presentation. So I appreciate everyone sitting in and listening. Happy to be finishing on time. As I stated at the beginning, would very much appreciate any kind of feedback that you had regarding the content or the manner in which I delivered the information. I would appreciate your participation in that post-webinar survey. As always, we are here at Business Controls to support you guys. So if you have any follow-up questions about the presentation, or maybe you get the presentation materials in a couple of days and you have another question that comes up, don't hesitate to give us a call or shoot me an email. I'd be happy to follow up with you. Thanks again for your time today, and have a great day, great afternoon.